as Jesus walked, so I shall walk, held by your same unchanging love. Be still, my soul. Oh, lift your voice and pray, Father, not my will, but yours be done. How in that garden he persisted, I may never fully know the fearful weight of true obedience. It was held by him alone. One wondrous faith to bear that cross, to bear my sin. What wondrous love. My hope was sure when there my Savior prayed, Father, not my will, but yours be done. When I am lost, when I am broken, in the night of fear and doubt, still I will trust in my good Father. Yes, to one great King I bow. As Jesus rose, so I shall rise in ransom glory at the throne. My heart restored, with all your saints I sing, Father, not my will, but yours be done. As we go forth, thou God and Father, lead us daily in the fight, that all the world might see your glory and your name be lifted high. And in this name we overcome, for you shall see us safely home. Now as your church we lift our voice and pray, Father, not my will, but yours be done. And in this name we overcome, for you shall see us safely home. Now as your church we lift our voice and pray, Father, not my will, but yours be done. Father, not my will, but yours be done. Father, not my...
Hey, Foundry, welcome back to our Thursday night midweek Bible study. It's good to see you guys, even if it is digitally. I hope you have been enjoying your time this week. I hope you have been keeping up with the reading plan, where we're supposed to be together through Exodus 20. So I hope you're keeping up with that. Remember, every Saturday and Sunday are grace days, because that's what we should be all about, New Covenant believers. A couple of quick announcements, some exciting announcements actually I've got for you that I want to throw onto your radar. I have, as of today, received permission from the rest of the pastoral staff to announce to you that the Foundry will resume face-to-face meeting very soon. We've talked about it. We are going to be able, starting on Thursday, the 18th of June, so that's a couple weeks from now, we are going to resume face-to-face Foundry midweek Bible studies. What we're going to do, I want to give you just a couple of heads up. What we're going to do is we're going to be meeting together here at the church in the atrium. We're going to continue the live stream, so we're going to keep putting this out there for folks that aren't comfortable coming back. But for folks who are ready to come back, we are going to be meeting in the atrium, same bat time, same bat channel, just doing it in the atrium. We're going to be maintaining all of the same precautions that the church has in place on Sunday mornings, all of the same social distancing requirements. We're going to be following all of the governor's executive order. We're going to be doing all those things, but we will be able to see each other and encourage each other face to face. So I hope you guys are encouraged by that. Mark your calendars. June the 18th, we will be back for the first time face-to-face here at Emmanuel Bible Church in the atrium. And immediately after that, on Sunday, June the 21st, we will also be meeting face-to-face instead of digitally on the live stream for our Sunday Foundry time together in studying God's Word. We'll still be live streaming that as well. So Thursdays will still be live streamed, Sundays will still be live streamed, but we will be meeting face to face. I hope you're encouraged about that. I am very encouraged about it. A couple other quick announcements. I want to remind you, this Sunday is going to be the church's first re-entry back to public worship. 2 worship services, one at 8 o'clock, one at 11. Everyone's welcome to come and worship with us here at Emmanuel Bible Church. For those folks who aren't comfortable coming back or just can't make it that Sunday, we will still be having the live stream at 9:30, so you're welcome to participate that way. If you want to come join us, we ask that everyone RSVP ahead of time, not to reserve a spot, but so that we can get a handle on the numbers that we're expecting to come back and join us this Sunday. That way we can make sure we have the appropriate space set aside and the appropriate precautions in place to maintain social distancing and keep all those things safe. So we'll see you this Sunday face-to-face for worship, and the beginning on June the 18th on Thursdays and June the 21st on Sundays. The Foundry is back in business face-to-face. So I'm encouraged by that. I hope you are too. One thing I want to let you guys know, you should mark this down on your calendars on 18th, 25th, June the 25th. What's this Thursday after the 25th? Yeah.
It's July 2nd.
July the 2nd. On Thursday, July the 2nd, we're going to have some early fireworks. We are going to have a Foundry Q&A session that is marked by some of the most brilliant minds available to us. Jordan Standridge will be there. Ryan Francis will be there. Dan Crabtree will be there, and they're even letting me join them. By the way, Jordan doesn't know this yet, so that's exciting. And Ryan is only conceptually aware of it. But we're going to have fireworks. It's going to be a Q&A. We're going to ask you guys to submit questions ahead of time. If you have questions about what we're reading, what we're studying, Sermon on the Mount stuff, questions about theology, questions about life, you should submit those ahead of time. You should email them to, hairgrove@ibc.church. No, you can't send them to me. You can't send them to me because I can't see the questions ahead of time. Check your email this week and you'll know where you can send your questions. But you're going to send the questions ahead of time. Cyrus and Wesley are going to look them over. They're going to moderate it. And they are going to set us up with the most blazingest, hottest, in-your-face Q&A session in the history of the Foundry, where Cyrus has, I would say maliciously and with great intent, picked the hottest hot sauces he could find in America. And we are going to answer questions and eat hot wings until one or all of us break down in tears. So mark your calendars for that. Hope you're excited about that. What we're going to be doing tonight is going to be something very different. We are beginning our summer series looking at surveys of Old Testament books. It's supposed to follow along with our Old Testament reading plan. Now, if you remember last week, I gave a little broad overview of the Old Testament, kind of in big blue arrows kind of way, big ideas and big themes, and talked about the books and the canon and how they're organized. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the first book of the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, and providing an overview of that book. Genesis is a unique beast in the books of the Bible. It is so big and so broad and intersects with so much theology. Every major doctrine that we believe as Christians, every major theme of the Bible finds its root, its seed, if you will, in the book of Genesis. And so trying to tackle a book like Genesis can be a bit overwhelming and daunting. I spent a lot of time in this past week trying to think about the best way to organize my thoughts. And I have chosen what is probably the worst possible option. We are going to walk through the book of Genesis together, all 50 chapters. But we're going to have a good time. We're going to enjoy ourselves. You know, there are a lot of people that try to outline the book of Genesis in one way or another. Probably the most common way people outline the book of Genesis is by using the generations of formula or the genealogies. They try to break it up in genealogies. I want to give you a very simple outline for the book of Genesis that you can kind of hang your hat on to understand how the book of Genesis is organized. And you kind of break it into two halves. You have Genesis 1 through 11, talks about God and the way he deals with mankind at large, all of his creation, all of humanity, Genesis 1 through 11. But picking up in verses 12, through the rest of the book, we get to see how God begins to interact through one particular family, the family of Abraham, the people of God. So if you want a broad outline for how to look at the book of Genesis, the first half talks about God and humanity. The second half is God and the family of Abraham. So here's what we're going to do. I want you to open up your Bible to the first page, page number 1, and we're going to begin looking at Genesis together. It begins in the Hebrew, Bereshith bara Elohim et hashamayim wa et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, my goal is to try and help you see both the meaning of each of these chapters as well as the significance of these chapters. Not only what they're teaching us, but what we should be taking away from it in our own lives as we study the book of Genesis. When we begin in Genesis chapter 1, we find the story of creation. And it is an overwhelming testimony to the absolute sovereignty of God. I hope you notice that that's how the book begins, but that word sovereignty is one of the key ideas that runs itself from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 50 of the book of Genesis, that God is sovereign. He is the creator of all things. He is supreme over all things. All things come from him. All things are to him. He is God. And Genesis 1 walks us through this idea of God's sovereignty in a unique and compelling way. We begin even just with the idea of what theologians call the aseity of God, this idea that God exists before all of creation exists, that he is distinct from his creation. He's not a part of it, that he exists independently, fully self-sustainingly in his person and nature. In the beginning, God. But then God, out of the overflow of his love and his benevolence, chooses to create. And he creates all things. And all things therefore belong to him, whether it's the cosmos or the earth or nature or plants or animals or even human beings, all things belong to God. And as God creates and demonstrates his sovereignty over all things, he also demonstrates the unique way he's created man by giving him this creation mandate, this twofold mission statement for all of humanity, that we would be fruitful and multiply, and that we would subdue the earth and reign over it. And so we learn, even in the first chapter, that God sovereignly creates all things, own all things, they belong to him, and that he created and sovereignly designed human beings uniquely in that creation to be his representatives on earth, acting, as it were, as kings, as princes over the creation he gave us. Now, what am I supposed to take away from a chapter like Genesis chapter 1? Just remember that everything belongs to God. Everything you read for the rest of Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament and everything you read for the rest of the Bible points back to this idea that God is the purpose. And God is the fountain, and God is the owner of all things. So that means everything's design, everything's purpose, everything's role, everything's function comes from God and exists for God. Genesis 1 also teaches us that God makes good things. He makes beautiful things. His design, his purpose, his role, his plan, his function for all things that he creates is good and even very good. Now, Genesis 1 leads to Genesis 2, and Genesis 2 is this more narrow scope of how God creates, specifically how he creates humanity. If Genesis 1's talking big picture, Genesis 2 talks more narrowly about what God's unique creative power for humanity was. And we see that mankind is a unique creation of God. I mean, just listen to the language of Genesis 2 and the intimacy that you read in there. How God breathes the breath of life into the nostrils of Adam. How God forms him carefully, like a master craftsman forms Adam out of the dust of the earth. How he sets Adam in a garden of perfect paradise and gives him this beautiful command, this vocation, this work to cultivate the garden that God has given to him. And then God creates male and female. You see here that biological sex, that gender is not an arbitrary thing, but a designed thing that God specifically put in place because he's designed human beings to live in companionship, to live in fellowship. And he even institutes the first marriage here. And we're reminded again, with the intimacy of this creation, the specificity of this creation, the compassion of this creation, we're reminded that God has a design and a purpose for every person, that our lives have purpose, our lives have value, and that our lives are designed to be lives of fellowship, both between God and man, and between man and all of humanity, especially between husband and wife. God has created a very good creation, but then Genesis 3 comes. What happens to paradise? It falls. God gives Adam and Eve the opportunity to obey, and they choose disobedience. They bring sin into God's perfect creation. And so Satan is introduced to the story. We find out that Satan is opposed to God. His primary goal is to attack human beings, and his primary tactic is to sow doubt that leads to disobedience. This is what Satan does. He begins by attacking Eve and asking this simple question: did God really say? Perhaps the most destructive question mark in all of history. Adam and Eve, of course, choose sin. They choose disobedience. And what sin does is that it immediately destroys the fellowship that God designed humanity to live in. Genesis 3 tells us immediately that they suddenly had shame. There's this wholeness that should exist in human beings by God's design, where we're unashamed before our Creator, where we're in righteousness and clad before Him in a way that needs not shirk or hide from the holiness of God, and yet that's been destroyed. That the fellowship between Adam and Eve has been destroyed as Adam immediately blames Eve, and Eve immediately blames the serpent. Now this perfect marriage that God created is already destroyed and in need of counseling. That the fellowship between man and creation is destroyed, where suddenly the childbirth that should have been such a beautiful and pleasant experience for the woman is now filled with pain and anguish. That the work, the vocation that God had given to man as this perfect and beautiful gift to enjoy cultivating the garden suddenly becomes filled with thorns and toil and anger, and ultimately fellowship is destroyed between man and God. And God says, you can no longer live in my garden. This is no longer your home. You must go. But what we also see in Genesis 3 is that God is a rescuing God. The theme that Jim Hamilton introduced to us, I talked about it last week, is that God brings salvation through judgment. That's exactly what we find in Genesis 3. God's word to Adam and Eve is that on the day that they eat of it, they will surely die. And they did die, but not immediately. They died surely, but not suddenly, because God brings salvation. He covers their nakedness. He casts them from the garden, but does not cast them away. And Genesis 3 should teach us that sin is more destructive than we imagine it to be. And that idea is going to run throughout the book of Genesis. Sin destroys everything it touches. Families, relationships, marriages, nations, kingdoms, everything sin touches is tainted and corrupted and broken. Genesis 3 teaches us that Satan is far more dangerous than we imagine he is. That when doubt is sown into our understanding of God's word, all of the foundation for our obedience is attacked and begins to crumble. But if Genesis 3 teaches us anything, it is that God is both just and gracious. We see both punishment and mercy. Death, but not yet. There's toil now for Adam, but there's still crops. There's pain in childbirth, but there's still family. There is sin, but there is still salvation. And the effects of that are not lost on us as we go to Genesis chapter 4. And we see that sin's lingering destruction begins to wreak havoc, not just with the first couple, but with every human being who inherits their sinful nature. Cain and Abel both inherit Adam's sinful nature. They're both offering sacrifices to God for forgiveness of sin. Cain is the firstborn from Adam and Eve. He should be the one to whom the blessing flows. He should be the one to whom the promise flows. He should be the one to whom the inheritance flows, and yet he doesn't do that. The sin that so easily entangles us corrupts even Cain's worship and asking for atonement. God has regard for Abel and his offering, but not for Cain. And Cain, faced with the reality of his sin, becomes the prototype for what temptation looks like for all human beings. God tells him sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you. You must master it, Cain. This picture of what temptation looks like for all of us. That sin is at hand, eager, ready to pounce, ready to consume us, ready to attack us, and we're given the choice of obedience. Cain chooses not to. Instead of choosing a path of obedience, instead of turning to God and offering a sacrifice for forgiveness, instead of running to God and seeking to be made whole again, you see instead Cain give way to bitterness, which leads to anger, which leads to murder, which leads to lying. And once again, we find salvation coming through judgment. Cain has murdered his brother. And God spares Cain's life. He sends him out. He puts a mark on him so that no one would kill him. And this salvation is evident while at the same time punishment is painful. And we read the rest of Genesis chapter 4, the lineage of Cain, all of Cain's descendants. It's a fascinating list as you're reading Genesis 4. It begins with a murder. It ends with a murder. And so Genesis 4 reminds us that there is no escaping sin's nature, but that God will have regard for those who obey him. And as sin is crouching at the door for us, so also must we choose to master it. So must we choose not to give in to temptation. And Genesis 4 tells us that sin increases. The world fills up with sin. Cain murdered his brother in a fit of angry rage. His descendant, Lamech, kills a man for just striking him. Sin grows and it increases, and many won't follow the Lord. But in God's providence, Cain's lineage is not the only one you find. Genesis chapter 5, the first genealogy of the Bible. And I know the temptation when we get to genealogies is to kind of skip over them. They're not that important. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with them. But every word of Scripture is profitable for reproof and teaching and correction and training in righteousness. So also is true of the genealogies. What is God teaching us in Genesis chapter 5? What do I learn from the genealogy of Seth? Well, just as there are those who follow Cain and reject God and embrace sin, so also are there those who follow Seth's pattern of obeying God. You have Enoch, who walks with God and is no more. You have Lamech, who is so diligently looking for the promise of God's seed that he gave to the woman in Genesis chapter 3, that he names his son Noah, hoping that finally this one will bring us rest. And you have Noah. Genesis 5 tells us that God has people on the earth, followers, trusters, longingers. And the question of Genesis 5 is quite simple. Which family do you belong to? Are you a descendant of Cain or are you a descendant of of Seth? Are you a rebel against God, or are you a follower of God? And so we see that the promise God gives in Genesis chapter 3, that one day from the seed of the woman will come one who will crush the head of the serpent. That one day God is going to send someone to undo all of the effects of sin and its destruction and its death is going to be fulfilled. He has brought a line through which the promise will come. Nonetheless, Genesis 6 tells us that mankind increases in its corruption. The key verse of Genesis 6 is found in verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. There's a contrast that Genesis 6 is trying to draw for us. The increasing corruption of the world contrasted against the trusting faith of Noah. Genesis 6 is filled with these enigmatic stories where theologians argue with each other for fun. Who are the Nephilim? Who are the sons of God? Who are these people being born to the daughters of man? But all of those stories are designed to help you understand what Moses is saying when he writes that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. Mankind's corruption has increased astronomically, logarithmically. But contrast that with the trusting faith of Noah, who walks with God. And again, we find judgment and salvation. Noah did all that according to what God had commanded. Sin's going to increase, yes. We understand that when we read Genesis 6. When we look at the world around us, we have a grid for how corrupt the world can be. Sin will increase, both globally and individually. But we also know that God will judge sin, and his judgment is cataclysmic. His judgment is total, and his judgment is final. But there's also hope that's found by putting our faith in God, just as Noah did. All that God commanded him, Noah did. He put his trust not in himself, not in his own righteousness, but in the promise and command of God. Genesis 7 leads us to the flood. Now, it's funny when you think about Genesis 7 and you think about the flood narrative, our primary thought is always one of destruction. We think of Genesis 7 and we primarily think of judgment, and well, we should. But of the 24 verses of Genesis 7, 17 and a half of them are about rescue. About the meticulous, specific rescue that God has planned for Noah and his family and for all the beasts of the earth. It's a story of judgment, yes, but it is also a story of salvation. You should be overwhelmed with the security of God's salvation. God saved exactly who he wanted, exactly how he wanted. It's God's own hand that closes the door. So while we read Genesis 7 and we are overwhelmed at the severity of God's judgment on sin, we're also overwhelmed at the security of God's salvation through his own judgment. Genesis 8 and 9 are telling us the story of the flood. It's best, I think, to take them as one idea, not separate chapters. I mean, if you notice, even in your ESV Bible, there's not even a chapter title at Genesis 9. It's just flowing into one story. Genesis 8 begins with this remarkable verse. But God remembered Noah. Have you ever done the math? Noah is floating on the ark for 370 days. 370 days of feeding the animals and cleaning the stables. 370 days of seasickness with no Dramamine. 370 days of looking out the window and seeing only waves. But God remembered Noah. And God brings Noah safely to rest on the mountain. And God brings the waters to recede. And you have this beautiful recapitulation of the creation narrative that's going on in Genesis 8. Have you ever noticed it? That just like God created where he separated the dry land from the waters, so also does he do it here. That just as all the creeping things populate the earth, so also do they do here. And God restates his creation mandate again, 2 times in Genesis 8 and 9. Be fruitful and multiply. Subdue the earth and fill it. And the story ends in Genesis 9 with this reminder that God remembers. God promises to remember. He remembered Noah, and he says, I'm going to put my bow in the sky. I'm making a covenant with you, Noah. It's an everlasting covenant. I will never again destroy the earth like this. And he promises to remember his covenant. There's a principle in that covenant. God's judgment on sin will not be total in this world. Sin will not be wiped away with a flood like it was in this world. Even though, as Genesis 9 shows us, the world will again be filled with corruption. Noah sins. Noah's sons sin. I mean, what are we supposed to remember? What are we supposed to learn? What's the significance of Genesis 8 and 9? That we worship a God who remembers. Even in the storms of this life, even in the long difficulties of this life, you worship a God who remembers you and knows you by name. We worship a God who restores after judgment. He brings his creation back into good order. We worship a God who rescues. That he has promised he will bring us through his judgment. We also learn that the flood can't solve our sin problem. You get to Genesis 10, you have what's called the Table of Nations, the meaning of which is very clearly stated in the text to explain to us where the nations come from. But if we should learn anything from Genesis 10, we should learn this: the intrinsic unity of all people on the earth. That we all belong to one family, one race of people, all descended from Noah, from Adam. But that means that what is true of all human beings is true of us. Our value as image bearers, yes. Our corruption as sinners, yes. That corruption's put on beautiful display in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. And on the surface, you read the Tower of Babel as just this explanation. How did all the languages come to be? But when you probe a little deeper into Genesis 11, you see some questions emerge, like, why did they build a tower? Why was it that all of the people who began to be born on the earth chose to build a tower? Well, the text tells us that they do it out of pride. We'll make a name for ourselves. But its juxtaposition to Genesis 7, 8, and 9 tells us that they're trying to find immunity from God's judgment. When God destroyed the earth, he covered it with a flood. What was sinful man's design? Or what was sinful man's response to God's judgment? Well, we'll build a tower bigger than his flood. Genesis 11 teaches us about our predisposition to try and subvert God's authority. And it is a pervasive problem. And it's true of every tribe and every language and every nation on earth. We're all trying to make a name for ourselves and escape God's judgment. And all of us, left to our own devices, would rather build a tower than obey God. So what is God going to do? He created humanity in a paradise, and we destroyed it with our sin. He washed the world clean with a flood, and we destroyed it in our sin. So God reveals his plan. His plan to fulfill the promise that he made in Genesis 3, that he would bring someone to crush the head of the serpent. He's going to do it through a family, through Abraham. It's a new era in the book of Genesis, that the blessing is going to come through one family. And you read in Genesis 12 what's called the call of Abraham. Abraham is a pagan, worshiping pagan gods, living in the land of Ur with his father, and he's taken out of that to live in the land of Haran, and he's living there, and then God calls Abraham. And it's significant that there's nothing about Abraham that's meriting a call. He's not powerful. He's old. He's 75 years old. He has no family, no descendants. He has a wife. He has a clingy nephew. He has some flocks. But God says, I will make my promise come through you. And these are the promises he gives in Genesis 12. I promise to give you a land. I promise to make you a nation. And I promise that you will be a blessing to all families. Those are the same promises that ring out through the rest of the book of Genesis. I am going to give you the land. I am going to make you a nation, and I am going to bring through you, through your family, through your offspring, the blessing to all nations. But Genesis 12 then immediately leads us into this story of Abraham going to Egypt. His fear and his failure as he's scared not of the God who's called him, but of man, of Pharaoh. And he makes this preposterous story saying that his wife is really his sister so that Pharaoh wouldn't kill him to take Sarah away from him. And you think, how can Abraham be this dense? But God rescues Abraham. And we're reminded again in this story that God's promises never fail. Just as we saw in Noah, just as we saw in the seed, God's promises will always come to be. And we're reminded here that we're saved, as Warren Wiersbe writes in his commentary on Genesis 12, we're saved not because of the promises we make to God, because of our trust in the promises that God has made to us. And so God does not permit his promises to fail. Even in Egypt, even in Abraham's fear and failure, God's promises never fail. We get to Genesis 13 and we find Abraham and Lot, or Abram and Lot. And at the surface, you read Genesis 13, and you think, okay, this is a story about Abraham being a peacemaker. And that's a good thing, and it is true, and we should notice that. But when you dig a little deeper, you begin to see what's really behind the scenes of Genesis 13. What's going on here? What's the meaning of this? Have you ever wondered why Abraham was so confident to let Lot pick? A lot of times you think, well, Abraham's just a nice guy, I guess. It's not that. He's demonstrating, even a little bit, his faith in the promises of God. Lot, you can pick wherever you want to go. I'll go to the other side because God has already made promises to me, and I know he'll fulfill them. He's promised a land. He's promised a nation. And you know that's the point because God brings that up in the verse 14. The Lord says to Abraham, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. For all the land you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. Arise, he says, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. Genesis 13 is a beautiful story of making peace in the midst of conflict, but it's really a story of trusting God and his promises. Genesis 14 becomes a painful picture where Abraham rescues Lot. Conflict has consumed Lot's family. 4 kings have risen up against 5 kings, and war, which is just the byproduct of man's sinful nature, has consumed Lot and carried him away. And suddenly Abraham rides into the rescue with what is probably the most remarkable sentence of this chapter. Here you have Abraham, who has 318 trained men at his disposal. He's got an army, still doesn't have a son. And he goes and he rescues Lot. And he brings him back. I would have loved to talk to Abraham about the after-action report of that conflict. Where he's drawing up on the sand table. We came in, we flanked him on the left, and we hit him on the right. And I would have loved to see it, but we're led to this person, this enigmatic figure, Melchizedek, who we know is a king of the city of Salem. He's a priest of the Most High God. Now, what are we supposed to do with Melchizedek? What's the point of that idea? Well, Genesis 14 is giving us a contrast. There's 2 kings here that Abraham's interacting with, Melchizedek and the king of Sodom. Sodom is the city of wickedness, of corruption, of fornication. It is the picture of corruption. But you learn a few things from studying Melchizedek. His name Melech means king. Zedek means righteousness. The place that he's the king of is the city of Salem, which is the city of peace. Abraham is being presented with a choice. Is he going to align himself with the corruption of this world, or is he going to align himself with the priest of the Most High God, the priest of righteousness, the king of peace? Then he chooses to follow the king of peace, to have nothing to do with Sodom. And what you learn from this is that Abraham is not afraid to fight, but he's also trusting in God. Genesis 15 is one of the most important passages in all of the Old Testament, one of the most important passages in the Bible. It's what we call the Abrahamic covenant. God makes a covenant, that's a promise, with both conditions and curses. And he makes a promise with Abraham. And his promise is to give him offspring. I am going to give you a descendant. But there's also curses. There's this story that we find in the depiction of Genesis 15 where he brings a female goat and a heifer and a ram and a turtle dove and a pigeon, and he cuts them all in half and he spreads them on the sides. And this is one of the ways that they would cut covenants in the old days, where the idea being, as both parties of the covenant walked between the two halves of these animals, they were invoking upon themselves the punishment, the ramifications, the condemnations that should come on them if they were to ever break this covenant. And God walks through it himself. And perhaps the most important verse of Genesis 15. Verse 6, he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. There's so much you could say about Genesis 15, but what should I take away from it? Take away at least two ideas from Genesis 15 that are significant for your life right now. Remember that God is a promise-keeping, covenant-making God. Everything that he has said he will do, he will bring to fruition. And remember that God is both the one who sets the terms of his promises and fulfills the terms of his promises. But the second big idea of Genesis 15 that we need to take away from this is that imputation of righteousness comes by faith. God counted Abraham righteous not because of what he did, but because of his belief, because of his trust in God. Now that trust is immediately attacked in Genesis 16. You have 86-year-old Abram here, 10 years since he received the first word of the promise when he was 75, that God would give him a nation and give him an offspring and give him a land. 10 years have gone by, no fulfillment. Doesn't look like anything's going to happen with his wife Sarah. And so he, following his wife Sarah's advice, takes matters into his own hands. Then he sleeps with his wife's maidservant and Hagar, the Egyptian, and has a child through her. What's the result of this? Abraham choosing to take matters into his own hands, the result is just pain and anger and estrangement and animosity and bitterness. But we also get to see a glimmer of God's compassion. Hagar, who's been ostracized by Sarah, who's been cast out of the camp, who's convinced she's going to die, hears that God will protect her and provide for her and bless her. Now, if you read Genesis 16 as a Christian, what are you supposed to take away from that? Well, take away this, that our attempts to be God will always backfire. That God is the one who's sovereignly in control of all things. God is the one who causes all things to happen according to his good purpose and his good plan and his good timing. We're called to trust him. God operates on his own timing, but also remember that God is more compassionate than we are. That God looks on the oppressed and the maligned and the persecuted and the downtrodden and the rejected and has compassion on them. This leads to Genesis chapter 17. What's called the covenant of circumcision. Now, another decade has gone by. Abraham is 99 years old. 24 years have gone by since he was first given the promise of faith from God. this promise of offspring and land, but also now in Genesis 17, this promise that I will be God to you and to your offspring after you. And God gives Abraham this sign, this seal, this mark of the covenant, this mark of circumcision. And have you ever wondered as you're reading Genesis 17, why circumcision? Of all the things that God could have chosen to seal this covenant with the people of Israel, why did he pick circumcision? Couldn't it have been like a wristband or something? What you find out is that circumcision is the mark of a priest. In the ancient Near East, in their cultures, priests were circumcised. And so when God says to Abraham, you and all of your offspring, every male offspring in your entire nation is going to be circumcised, he's saying you are going to be a nation of priests, a family, a clan, a tribe, a people of priests. You will be different from all of the nations around you. You'll be distinct because you are the people through whom my promise is coming. You are the people to whom I will be your God. And we're reminded again in Genesis 17 that God is always faithful to his promises. That God is going to bring the seed that he's promised. And that God's people are supposed to be distinctive. As Christians, we read Genesis 17, and it's so easy to spin off into questions about doctrine and theology where we miss the point that God has designed his people to be distinct from the nations. Of course, Genesis 17 ends with Abraham still trying to rewrite God's plans. Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Genesis 18 shows us Abraham the intercessor. Abraham is promised Isaac, so also is Sarah. But also God visits Abraham and he says, I'm going to bring destruction on Sodom. Now, what's the basis upon which God brings Abraham into his plans for Sodom? Why does God, who is there visiting Abraham, decide, I want to let Abraham know what I'm planning to do with Sodom? Well, he tells us. It's because all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. Because Abraham and the people of Abraham, to whom the promise is given, are going to have a unique relationship, bringing blessing to the nations. And so God tells him what's going to happen to one of the nations. And notice how Abraham attempts to be a blessing by interceding on behalf of those around him. And this story highlights God's patience, not only with Sodom and allowing this sin to continue as it has, but also with Abraham and the 50 and the 40 and the 30 and the 10. It highlights God's mercy, but also God's justice. And as Christians, we read Genesis 18 and we're aware of the fact that we need intercession because God is going to judge the wicked, but he will also rescue the righteous. And we see this on display in Genesis 19 in perhaps the most painfully poignant way we find in all of the Old Testament. We're reminded again of what's become of Lot. He is living in Sodom. He's living at the gates, and we see Lot's what we might call relative righteousness compared to the rest of Sodom. He attempts, and many times when the angels come into the city to try and act in some capacity in a righteous way, he says, come stay with me. Come, let me offer you protection. Let me give you hospitality. He even tries in a thing that sounds so egregiously horrible to us, to offer his daughters in their place to rescue them from the defilement that the people of Sodom are trying to bring. And so Lot's, I say, relative righteousness is put on display in contrast to the unrestrained wickedness of Sodom. But both of those pale in comparison to God's remarkable rescue. God is a God who brings salvation through judgment. God brings a powerful picture of his wrath on Sodom. The city is consumed, the valleys are consumed, the people are consumed. Even Lot's wife is destroyed because of her longing for that world of wickedness. But God brings salvation. Now, what am I supposed to do with Genesis 19? It's a powerful story that highlights both the effect of sin, but also the power of God's judgment. I mean, Lot simply shouldn't be at the gates of this city. Lot shouldn't be staying in Sodom. Lot shouldn't be compromising with the people. And that kind of compromise cost him his sons, his wife, his family, his honor. Sin destroys everything it touches, and yet God still brings salvation. Genesis 20 is a remarkable chapter. We're introduced to this character who's going to show up a few times in the next couple chapters, this guy named Abimelech. And the story begins in the most remarkable way, what sounds like a repeat of chapter 12, right? Abraham went to Egypt and he told Pharaoh, this is my sister, not my wife, so you wouldn't kill me. Now he goes to visit Abimelech, who is in the neighborhood, and he does the same thing. This is my wife. This is my sister, not my wife. And Abimelech is rescued in a dream by God and prevented from doing something egregiously sinful. And we see in this chapter, why does Moses give us chapter 20? Why do we need to know this? Because we need to be reminded that Abraham's not perfect. He sins, he fails, he falls, he lies. But God will not allow his promises to falter. He is a God who causes all things to work together for good. If you read Genesis 20, you should come away with at least a couple of ideas, not the least of which is that Bible heroes are anything but. And yet God remains sovereign. Genesis 21 shows us Isaac on the scene. Finally, the son of promise has shown up. The promise that for 25 years Abraham has been waiting to hear comes. And God is faithful to his promise. But in that coming of promise and that coming of blessing, so also comes the pain that exists between Hagar and Ishmael and Sarah and Isaac. And again, Hagar is left oppressed and rejected and ostracized and left for dead. And just as we see God's faithfulness on display, we see his compassion on display again. That God is a compassionate God. That he is with the oppressed. He is with the poor. He is with the downtrodden and the forgotten. It's moments like this that I'm glad I've read Genesis 9. God is a compassionate God. Have we lost the... You're still going? Genesis 22. The Aqaba, it's called. The binding of Isaac. This remarkable passage about God testing Abraham. Now Abraham at 99, 100 years old, is put to the test by God. Abraham, he says, here I am. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, why does God test Abraham? Have you ever wondered that? It's a helpful question. Why does God test Abraham? It's not for God's benefit. It's for Abram's. Abraham is finally learning to trust God. And he brings his son Isaac and takes him to the mountain. And they climb up the mountain, Isaac carrying the wood on his own back, not knowing from where the sacrifice will come, but Abraham trusting that God will provide it. Genesis 22 is a picture of faith. It's trusting that God is the one who will fulfill his promise. Abraham didn't know exactly how God would do it. He didn't know if God would bring his son back to life after having killed him. But he knew that God would fulfill his promise. But Genesis 22 also prepares us for the idea of the God who provides the sacrifice, of the same God who would provide his only son as a sin offering and bring his only son back from the dead. Genesis 22 is a poignant picture of the gospel. Genesis 23 is a picture of Sarah's death. And what's the point of Genesis 23? Why do we have this story about Abraham and the cave of Machpelah, it's called? On the one hand, it shows us simply how Abraham acquires legal possession of some of the land. It's also a picture of Abraham trusting in God's promises. 22 is trusting that God will provide the sacrifice. 23 is trusting that God will provide the land. I need to buy this land and I need to bury my wife here because this is where I and my descendants will live. But also this cave of Machpelah shows up again and again and again in the rest of the book of Genesis because it is the resting place of Abraham. And to be there is to be joined to the promise of Abraham of the land. Genesis 24 brings us to Isaac and Rebekah. It's the longest chapter of the whole book of Genesis, 67 verses, and it's about a marriage. That sounds very godlike, that the longest chapter is about a marriage. You see, a son does not a nation make. In this remarkable story of sending the servant and finding the daughter and bringing her back, and we should be struck by God's sovereignty. God is in charge, Genesis 24 reminds us. He's in charge of big things like nations and floods. He's also in charge of personal things like spouses. And he's even in charge of little things like who's going to bring the water jug to the well. 24 introduces us to this family. 25 introduces us to this family's problems. Abraham has descendants. That's a blessing. God's promises are going forth. God is being faithful to what's going on. But this family is not without its problems, not without its troubles. Isaac's sons, these two nations, a fulfillment of the promise he gave to Abraham, but a clear juxtaposition created between them. Esau, the rugged, manly son, I imagine he was a Texan, rough and of the land and hunting and covered with hair. And Jacob, the mama's boy, quite literally, hiding in the tents, quiet. Esau, we find out, is a man who despised his birthright and despised God. And what Genesis 25 is supposed to teach us is very clearly explained to us in Romans 9. What's the point of Genesis 25? Election. What's the significance of this? Even before they were both born, before they'd ever done anything right or wrong, God had chosen that Jacob would be the child through whom the promise would go. Before Esau despised his birthright, God knew him. Before Jacob deceived his brother to steal it, God knew him. So even though Esau despises and Jacob deceives, God decides. Genesis 26 brings us back to this familiar character. We're starting to learn him now, Abimelech. And now Isaac is faced with the same choices that his father was given. Is he going to stay and trust in God? He does. Is he going to lie and say his wife is his sister? He does. Isaac is making the same choices that his father made. But at least Abimelech learns, even if Isaac didn't. And God here reaffirms the covenant to Isaac, that Isaac is the child of promise. So God remains faithful even though Isaac remains faithless. Genesis 27, Isaac now blesses Jacob. Isaac is a remarkable story in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. He starts so strong, doesn't he? I mean, the first thing you know about Isaac is him trusting his father and carrying the wood up the mountain and climbing onto the altar without protest. He starts so strong, and yet he ends so poorly. He tries to subvert God in order to bless his favorite son. And we see Jacob starts poorly. He's a child of deception. That's what his name means, Yaakov, deceiver. We find a family destroyed by sin because sin has consequences. Yet God still remains sovereign. Genesis should use over and over and over again this picture of brothers to make clear to us the depravity of our sin. Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and the 11. Genesis 28 through 31, I like to call it ladders and Labans. You have Jacob on the run. Isaac tells his son, you can't marry one of these pagan women. And so Jacob obeys. Isaac says the same thing to Esau. Esau doesn't. He marries a Canaanite woman because he knew it wouldn't please his father. And you have God reaffirming the covenant with Jacob. In his dream, he is reminded that all of the covenant promises are going to flow through him. God says, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and the north and the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. That the covenant blessings will not stop, despite the fact that Jacob is a deceiver and Isaac is a failure, that Abraham is a liar. God's promises will not falter. And Jacob is indeed a deceiver. We have this story we're so familiar with, and the story of Leah and Rachel and working for 7 years, and then the deceiver gets deceived by Laban, and then he spins around and he deceives Laban, and you have this picture that we find in Genesis 29 of Jacob's children and how he has the two wives, Leah and Rachel, and Leah whom he has no regard for, and Rachel whom he loves and adores, and how God brings child after child after child to Leah, and Leah is marked by her bitterness and names her children with these bitter and angry names like Reuben and Simeon, and then finally she begins to praise and worship God and her son Judah. And it ends in chapters 30 and 31 with how the turntables have turned. Just more deceit, followed by escape, followed by theft, followed by lying, and then finally peace. And we learn in Genesis 28 through 31, this Ladders and Laban section of the book of Genesis, that God is providentially providing and fulfilling all of his promises, even though he's doing so through the sinful practices of people on the earth. God is sovereign. 32 and 33, I like to call Jacob and Esau part 2. Jacob prepares to meet his fate, and he wrestles with God, and God names him Israel, where God spares his life even though he wrestles and struggles against him. And just as God spares Jacob's life, then Esau spares Jacob's life, and this has a powerful impact on Jacob in the story of his life. And it's emblematic of Israel's relationship with God, struggles and salvation. But it's also a beautiful picture of reconciliation, a picture of forgiveness. Brothers in the book of Genesis are almost always the foil. They're almost always the picture of corruption. Cain and Abel and Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau. But what we find in this story in chapter 32 and 33 is that there's also reconciliation. There's hope. There's forgiveness. 34 is this terrible story of rape, what we find in Dinah. What we also find in Genesis 34 is that sons take after their fathers. Jacob's sons are liars and deceivers, just as he is. We learn that sin will have its devastating effect on our lives, on our families, on our rewards, on our promises. The way that Simeon and Reuben act, or the way that Simeon and Levi act here, removes from them the promise of prominence in the inheritance. Which is what makes chapter 35 so remarkable, that out of this terrible story of rape and murder comes this story of blessing. Finally, Jacob pursues purity. God reaffirms the covenant to him. And now Isaac, 20 years later, finally passes on. You remember how that story started? Isaac, I don't know when I'm going to die. It's so close. Let me bless you. 20 years later. We're also introduced to the 12 tribes. God is fulfilling his promises. God's covenant is being reaffirmed. God has proven himself faithful through the wicked deeds of human beings even. You get to Genesis 36, Esau's descendants, another one of the genealogies. A couple reasons. What's being taught to us in Genesis 36? Well, this is where the nations come from. This is also a fulfillment of the promises that God made to Abraham, that he would make you the father of many nations. Also, one of the great things about Genesis 36 is you get one of the coolest names in the Bible, Oholibama. That's a name right there. I don't know why it's not on the top. I don't know why it's not the top of anybody's baby name list, but Oholibama is the way to go. What you find in Genesis 36, as you hear this story being relayed to us about all the descendants that flow from Esau, is that God will fulfill his promises, but also that sin has lingering effects. Esau's rejection of God, his rejection of the birthright, Esau's sin against his father and sin against his brother has effects as the nations that are being listed there are Edom, this longtime rival of the nation of Israel, this enemy. Genesis 37 brings us into the final section of the book of Genesis. We begin to be introduced to Joseph and his story. Genesis 37 is Joseph's dreams section, where Joseph is the favorite son of his father, and if ever a dad should know better than to have a favorite son and dote on him, you'd think it would be Jacob. Joseph has two dreams, letting you know this thing is firmly fixed by God, that he is going to be God's instrument for saving and providentially caring for and looking after his family. And once again, we find typical of Genesis, this betrayal by the brothers. We're reminded in Genesis 37 that God is sovereign. All things happen according to his plan and his purpose to cause all things to work together for good. Genesis 37 should be a poignant reminder to us of the effect of pride in our lives. Joseph has this dream, this vision, this understanding that he's going to be powerfully used by God, and yet he uses that to puff himself up over and against his father and his mother and his brothers. And the effects are devastating. He's sold into slavery. Genesis 38, perhaps the most painful tangential story ever. But it's an important story. It's significant to what's going on. You have Judah and Tamar. Judah, who is the son to whom the prominence will flow, the scepter will be bestowed on him and on his tribe, abdicates his responsibility and abdicates what he's supposed to do. He has sons who are wicked, who are killed by God for their wickedness. And what he should do is provide for his family and provide for his lineage and provide for Tamar by giving her a husband. He doesn't do it. And Tamar uses this deceitful, duplicitous, disgusting example to make clear to Judah the depravity of his sin. And he does. I mean, Genesis 38 should show us that Judah, the one through whom the promise is going to come, puts the promise in jeopardy with his own sin and his own arrogance and his own pride. But God will not allow his promises to falter. Genesis 39 jumps us back into Joseph's story. We read of Potiphar's wife and the temptation that is put before Joseph and the righteousness he pursues instead, and the punishment that comes on him, the persecution. The point of Genesis 39, the lesson we learn from Genesis 39 is that trials are going to come even on the ungodly, but that God is sovereign in those trials for a purpose, we see. The Lord is with Joseph, it reads. That idea is continued into Genesis 40 with the baker and the cupbearer and these two fellow prisoners who are sharing their dreams. And Joseph tells them what's going to happen. And God, in his providential care and sovereign control of the universe, brings those things to happen. And Joseph is demonstrated to be a man who's capable of interpreting dreams and someone who's going to be used by God in a powerful way, and is still languishing in a cell because trials come even on the godly. So that in Genesis 41, when Joseph is remembered by the cupbearer and when he comes before Pharaoh and he interprets his dreams, we begin to see how God is providentially, sovereignly orchestrating all of the terrible, painful, tragic parts of Joseph's life to bring him into exactly the right place at exactly the right time to fulfill and care for the promises that God has made. Genesis 42 through 45 are the familiar stories of Joseph interacting with his brothers. He's been raised to prominence in Pharaoh's kingdom in Egypt. He's second only to the Pharaoh. He's storing away food for the famine. And these brothers flee from the famine in Israel, and they come and they submit themselves to Joseph, not knowing who he is. And Joseph becomes a remarkable picture now. How will Joseph respond to the betrayal of his brothers? He's had 20 years since he's been sold into slavery as a young child. 20 years of enduring the certainly manifold temptations of Potiphar's wife, of being locked in prison, of being made a slave. But instead of being the picture of bitterness and anger and revenge, he's the picture of forgiveness and mercy and compassion. When we read Genesis 42 through 45, we are supposed to be overwhelmed with the picture of grace. Never let anyone tell you that grace is a New Testament concept. Genesis 46 through 47 are telling us the story of God bringing his people into Egypt, where he protects his promises, even in a way they don't know is going to be painful in the long run. That lead us to Genesis 48 and 49, a massively important section of the book of Genesis where the covenant is being restated. Verse 4, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And the promises pass on. They pass over Reuben and over Simeon and over Levi because of their sin. They land on Judah, who will lead and take prominence over the 12 tribes of Israel. And 48 and 49 take us back to Machpelah, back to Abraham, back to the land, back to the covenant that God has made, back to the promises, back to the seed. We're supposed to be reading the end of Genesis and being reminded that God is a faithful God, a sovereign God, who will always fulfill all of his promises. And yet Genesis 50 ends in this depressing note. Joseph buries his father. He forgives his brothers. He trusts in God. He poignantly states the verse that we've committed to memory, verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And yet the book of Genesis ends in a coffin in Egypt, but with a note of hope. And what are we as Christians supposed to do with the book of Genesis? We're supposed to be overwhelmed with the sovereignty, compassion, mercy, faithfulness, holiness, judgment, and salvation of God. What I'd like to do with the little bit of time that I have, I've been asked if I would speak just briefly about what we see going on around us in our nation. And I'd like to do that. And as I do, I want to begin by just honestly acknowledging this idea that I don't know that I know all the right answers. Shepherds are sheep as well. I'm trying to have my thoughts and my judgments and my actions shaped by God and by His Word through this. So I hope that as I spend just a couple minutes talking about what's going on, that it'll be received with grace. I think that God's Word is sufficient for us. I think it has the answers that we need in the times of calamity. I think it's right and appropriate for us to view the circumstances not only of this week, but of the last 400 years, trying to find out how we can be shaped by God. I mean, you can't read the book of Genesis and not be overwhelmed with the idea that God is sovereign even and through the wickedness of human beings. I mean, over and over and over again, we find in the book of Genesis God's promises prevailing despite the wickedness that surrounds them. So as a Christian, I don't know exactly what to think about all of the circumstances and situations, but I do know that God is faithful. I know that God is a God of the oppressed and the persecuted and the ostracized. He's the God who seeks after Hagar. He's the God who is with Joseph. So I trust in that. We've spent 8 weeks now asking ourselves, what are you trying to teach us, God, through COVID? I think it's right for us to ask, God, what are you trying to teach us now through the turmoil and unrest of our nation? I think it's clear that racism is a pervasive and persistent sin problem in our country. It's by no means the only sin that marks our nation, but it is among the most painfully obvious. And Christians should stand in stark contrast to the world around us. I mean, just as God called Abraham's descendants and made a covenant with them and gave them the sign of circumcision to demonstrate how distinct they're supposed to be from the world, so also should the church be abundantly, clearly, markedly distinct from the world around us. And our world is going to be marked by sin. And our world is going to be marked most especially by the sin of racism. And it has no place in the church. It has no place in the heart of a Christian, none whatsoever. The church should be a place that is the perfect picture of hope, where in bright and stark contrast to a sinful world, we see human beings treated with the image and value and respect that all of them deserve by being image bearers of God. And I agree with the words I read or the words I heard from a pastor down in Georgia this week. I believe it is insufficient as a Christian to simply say that we aren't racist. I think Christians must be intentionally anti-racist, as he points out. Racism is an egregious sin against God and against other human beings. And just as Christians stand in opposition to all manner of sin, whether it's lying or adultery or pornography or abortion, so also must we be just as vociferously, loudly anti-racism. I think that it is a sad testimony to the state of the church that so many people see us and are not immediately struck by our opposition to the devaluing, to the debasement, to the oppression that so many human beings that share our neighborhoods and share our classrooms and share our homes are subject to. And as Christians, as the church, we need to be actively proclaiming the value and worth and dignity of every human being. And more than that, we need to be the ambassadors of a God who is compassionate on the downtrodden, who seeks out the persecuted, who lifts up the abused and oppressed. We should vociferously speak out against racism. I think in addition to that, the church needs to be a place that is weeping with those who weep. We should be marked with an unbridled compassion for others. I mean, the pain that people in our nation feel is real. And you don't have to endorse every jot and tittle of a person's position to mourn with them. And I think it's exactly what we're called to do. I think it's what Romans 12 is telling us to do. I think very specifically in Romans 12, it's telling us to do that with unbelievers. To weep with those who weep. To mourn with those who mourn. It's no sign of weakness for a Christian to share in the lament of another human being who's suffering. And I don't think that want to be cautious with my words. I don't think that we primarily accomplish that through virtue signaling. I think that's what the world uses because that's the only tool the world has. As Christians, I think we're called to signal our virtue by living virtuously. I think it's what we talked about in Matthew chapter 5 last Sunday, about being salt and being light, about living kingdom righteousness, and pursuing peace and mercy and compassion and purity. Christians should, before all other human beings, have a heart for those who are persecuted and oppressed. And I think that's going to look like the church being a place of real reconciliation. Not abstractly, not generically, not broadly. It's never been the mission of the church to bring about civic or governmental change. It's not the tool we're equipped with. We're given the gospel. But we're also told the gates of hell can't stand against us. I mean, so many Christians, and especially white Christians like myself, are trying to wonder, what am I supposed to do? My heart is broken when I look at the world around me. I'm saddened and I weep as I look at daughters who don't have fathers and husbands who don't have wives and mothers who don't have sons, and I'm wrecked by it. What am I supposed to do? Well, I think at the very minimum, I should live in a way that's compassionate towards others. I think that's what it means to be salt and light. That I should be loving the people around me with a sincere love, a genuine love. A love that the world can't comprehend. A love that the world doesn't have a grid for. Because it's not a love that's primarily focused on what it gets out of the deal. It's not a love that's primarily focused on it being merely the instrument to bring about societal change. It's a love that's born out of love for the image bearers that God has created and made. So I think it looks like pursuing peace in your own home, with your own neighbors. And I think it looks like speaking up for truth and speaking up for justice and speaking up for righteousness, absolutely. But I think it looks like personal holiness first. Again, I don't know that I have all the answers to these questions. I'm hoping to grow in my understanding of it. I can tell you that I have personally been helped in thinking through these issues by reading a book. It's a book put together by a handful of Christian authors, H.B. Charles and Danny Aiken down at Southeastern, and Jim Hamilton at Southern, and Carl Hairgrove out at Grace Community Church. I think it's been helpful for me. I ordered a bunch of copies of this book that I hope will be here soon. And so if you're interested in a copy of this book when we meet back together on Thursday the 18th, I'd be glad to provide you a copy of it. But I also think that perhaps the most practical thing we can do is to pray. And so that's what we're going to do in just a moment. We are going to move into our Zoom time together, our discussion groups, and I invite you to spend that time praying for our nation, for healing, for reconciliation, praying that there would be powerful examples of the kind of forgiveness that we read about in Genesis 47 and 48 and 49, where Joseph showers his brothers with undeserved mercy. I invite you to pray for God to bring justice, for God to punish those who are wicked. I pray that God would also rescue those who desperately need him. So I invite you to spend this time praying.